to open the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Okay, a couple of seconds.
Oh, sorry, one last thing I forgot to mention. We want to record this debate, so if anyone wishes to not be recorded or opt out of it, just please declare so before your speech starts.
Okay, it's fine to record me. I give my consent. Okay, couple of seconds. 3, 2, 1. Well, in my speech, firstly, I will talk which kind of people we're talking about, who owns those places, who is legitimate owner, and etc. The second is what mechanisms we introduce to make an effective providing these houses to the people who really need. And the third, we show alternative in opposition side, which makes the status quo inexpensive, etc. And in the at last, we'll provide impacts. Well, firstly, which people in status quo owns that places? We don't believe that about the healthy people or the people with a good mind and etc. Because even if your house is very bad, it costs money. Land where your house stays, it costs money and etc. And all of the people want some money, they can at least sell, etc. What probably we're talking about who owns the places, it's probably two kind of people. First, it's the dead people. In status quo, there could be some bureaucratic problems, like in Japan, like in different countries, where even after the death of the owner, the place can't go to government and etc. Or place can't go very easily to someone ownership, can't be sold to other people because it needs very hard, important bureaucratic stuff. And those why these houses can be used for several years and etc. A little bit later. And the second type of people, what we're talking about is we're talking about probably the people who are have not good condition health, for example, who can be mind issue problems, who also can be physical issue problems. In first case, we don't believe that those people can at least do something with their own because they can't think adequately and etc. etc. The second people who are have not good health, we probably believe that those people are good, probably can have good mind and etc. They also can sell their houses and etc. So probably we're talking about the people who can't manage their houses, and this why even the using by those people can't be realized in any circumstances. Well, by that we provide now at least why it should be fair to give the homeless people to live there, why it's very, very legitimate. Because those, firstly, it's much more better to help for someone than helping without any negative sides to the other one. What negative sides? We're not harming the owners. They don't even realize that those things are happening, etc. So we don't see actual very, very problem. My partner will develop and provide different analogies, I guess. Well, what about mechanisms which we introduce? At least we probably we're not trying to give for drug addicted people that houses, because it's very ineffective way doing that. We probably, when we are government, when we can do that, we can easily check per a month or per 2 months what is happening in this house. Are those the owners, the people who live now newly in those places can live, can use those places properly and etc. Do these places become the very bad and etc. Do they have good conditions to consist those save these places? Can they live better in those places and etc.? Otherwise, because when the new homeless who live in those houses will be exchanged by the other homeless who can live better and etc. So we don't see problem. So we believe that even if you are homeless, you have an interest, you have an motivation to keep safe that houses. It means that your house will not get worsened. It means house will keep safe in good conditions and etc. Because otherwise it can be exchanged by the other people. Okay, now let's move the next point. Why it's very crucial and necessary. In status quo, why government do provide money for the homeless people do provide social protection for the homeless people, social protection for the poor people. At least first reason why government do that, government want to provide, want to readapt those people. Government is not interested in people who do not pay taxes, because government is not getting profit from just giving a $500 for homeless people because they are the citizens of that country. But what in really interest the country in, it's like getting a more taxes, as I told previously. But now it's a very crucially important in status quo that the homeless people can't pay taxes. There are few reasons can be. We are probably are not talking about very drug addicted, very marginal, and the very bad kind of homeless people. We're talking about the homeless people who try to readapt, who want to be like as average middle class people. But the problem is, as like in most of the countries, in Kazakhstan, in Japan, I don't know, in Europe, in all different countries, the houses expensive, very expensive. Even they at least takes the half of your salary. It means like in very poor countries, or it doesn't matter, in very rich countries, you have to spend at least the half of your salary, even the 70%, it depends on countries, to like pay for these houses. And etc. It's not affordable for all of the people, because for other half of the salary, they have to buy food, they have to get additional stuff, they have to get like pharmacy, they have to get medical insurance, and etc. So they cannot afford these houses, etc. It means like they all time will get in trap of poorness, because in status quo, the employer will not give the people who are living outside, because employers are not interested in providing the work for homeless people because they think they are marginal, etc. Well, in our side, they at least now have a house for free. It means like the most of the salary they can spend for insurance and etc. The most of the salary they can spend for the additional stuff to look better, to have very good conditions in health. It means like they have more opportunities to get job and etc. In overall, which means like it's more opportunities to get an additional people, to get an middle class people. It means like in all of the pluses, all of the positive impacts in our side, in the sides of the opening government. Thank you very much. We vote for OG.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the leader of opposition. Here, here.
Okay, thank you. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. So, dear panel, what do we get today from the government? And I want to just like address a few comments. Their approach to this motion is a bit lenient, on the point that like you started saying that we will just give these houses to people with like mental health, with mental health issues, with disabilities and stuff. But do you think that putting these people in house is gonna solve their problems? These people need like others to look up to them and stuff. And plus, these people should have by the government like psychiatric hospitals, institutions for special needs and stuff. So this is one. The second point that will be rebutted will be within our 3 main points that are: first, we will be speaking about the regulating several homeless people in one house, and how this will have like several like 4 or 5 mechanisms, something like that I will be explaining. The second point is the unjustifiability of this action from the government by the respect of the social contract between the stakeholders in this motion, which are 3 basically, or the main 2 are the government and poor people, but the third stakeholder, which is the victim, will be people who own private properties in this country, right? And I will be explaining it within 2 mechanisms as well. The third point is the sanctity of private property and the respect which is related to the previous point, but I will discuss it on the side as well. So first thing first, regulation several homeless people in one house. How? Like, it is a clear logic that we have more homeless people than existing private properties that are not used, right? So how are you going to put several homeless people in one house? How are you gonna make sure that these people will not hurt each other? And how are you gonna make sure that these people are really homeless? Because when you are opening this door like this way, you will have like I just want to comment on this, that this solution is not sustainable. It is just short term, like until when you are going to follow up. I will take CJ's clarification.
Just to be clear, this is not a debate about whether or not we should try and have subsidies or provide housing to unhoused people. That's the status quo. It's whether or not it's legitimate for a state to stop someone who needs a house from taking that house and living in it when no one else was.
Okay, so let me continue on this point because it has response for your answer. So the thing is that, like, why do we need to stop like homeless people from going, or people claiming homelessness to go there? Because if you don't stop them, you will have other people who are now like the majority of the world renting houses all over the metropolitan. You will have them go out because and say that we cannot pay rent. Therefore, what we will do, the easiest solution is to go and squatter somewhere else. So you will have another squattering promotion policy from the government, that people will be aiming to live just like the easy life, that I will go like, okay, I cannot pay for rent. It's taken, like the government says, 70%, 80% from my salary in a poor country, in like a less developed country. What I will do is that I will go and squatter and like go to this property that is not used and say that I am homeless. I cannot afford to pay for my rent, right? So the thing is, the second point on the same thing is that there should be other solutions that the government should provide for the homeless people or people who cannot, like more affordable houses and stuff. But and this is leading us to the second point, the social contract between the parts of the country. Like I, as a person who works hard and thought about how to become more rich and invest in apartments, buying apartments in order to rent them, or in order to just leave them for the future when I'm back from working abroad or something. I have the right to leave that property the way it was in the beginning, because that's my safe zone as a citizen of that country. And that's where I want to go back after finishing my studies abroad, after 20 years, when I want to just like stop working. I need to have that place for me. And I cannot have it just like go for have someone who didn't work that hard compared to me and go take it and live with it and enjoy the hard work that I did. This is the first point. The second point is that how are you going to regulate that in terms of with which right does the government does that? Like they can take taxes, they can take like whatever they want from the citizens. We all pay taxes. Why do I have to give my private property and not the others? Like it's not equal on the social hierarchy, right? And also the government can basically, even if in their best case scenario where the government is poor, where the government cannot afford to build like affordable housing or institutions to take care of homeless people, at least asking the consent of the owners can be a solution. But still, we believe that as the opposition, that this kind of thing really is empowering bad habits of the society. And these are like, people are going to be more lazy. Like you will find, I don't know, but like when people are claiming that, mental health and like I cannot work, I don't have a house to stay, and I will just like go and take a house, and like the government doesn't have the right to take me out of the house. I'm basically like just still giving another example to people that are like suffering and working hard and stuff, which we know that like the majority of the world is poor. Well, we'll just be giving them a reason to be more lazy and not work hard. And we know that in the modern world, people will be work 2 or 3 jobs a day in order to make their life in big cities, and it will improve in like accepting this kind of motion will give them the mind that like, okay, I just need to work 1 job to afford food, but for the housing, like I will just go and find a beautiful house that is not used like in any kind of place, and I will squat it, and no one has the right to take me out. And this will improve, will open the doors, a flat door for the poor people to ask for more, because don't tell me that they will get satisfied with only the house. For example, they have a lot of cars. Why don't I get a car from them? Like they don't use it, right? And the government will be, okay, use it. Like here are a lot of free cars that you can use. So for all these reasons, like what we get from our side as an opposition today is, if this motion happens to be accepted, you are losing. Like it's just short term, and you cannot regulated for a long term, and it will result in a lot of other problems. The second thing is that it's unjustifiable for the third stakeholder, the victim stakeholder. And the third thing is that it opens a flat gate door for poor people, and it is against the sanctity of private property.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
So can you hear me? Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Dear panel, firstly, rebuttal of opposition. So 3 points that they bring. Firstly, the regulations of a government, like to make sure that those people were homeless. We do believe that the government can control that, and even if they cannot, we do believe when we say that when government do allowed homeless people to come to those property, that means that actually only homeless people will come to that property, and if someone else will do that, that means that actually government will do something with that people, will somehow punish them and some other stuff like that. So we do believe that regulation will work normally, because like government already can regulate those things, like who is homeless people and something like that. So second point that they have, like it is not fair to those people because maybe they will come back. Okay, we do believe when we are talking about like property that hasn't used for a long time, that means that like the owner of that property has not came to that, and most likely government can even don't know where is that person. So actually my teammate already explained that we do have the situations like for example, when a person is dead and the property still is going to that person that is dead. Secondly, we do have cases when, for example, people do buy some property and then they just simply don't use that. For example, they bought that and now 30 years gone and it is like still done and not used. So that those are the cases that we actually talking about. So most likely the situation when you just go into 3 to 5 jobs, then you go to some other country for 5 years, you come and some other people are living there. Those are not relevant to this motion. Why? Because we are talking about some the property that has lost for a long term. And third case, even if it will happen like the same as opposition said, like those people will say that for there for a short term, that is even that is still better than the opposition world. Why? Because firstly, those people simply have where to stay, and most likely in opposition world not. Secondly, that property is just used more effective than in opposition world, and that is the thing that I will explain. So 3 things in my speech. Firstly, why that is fair to take that property from people that own that. Secondly, why that will be like more effective, and thirdly, some motivation and responsibility of people that buy those lands. So first thing is about fairness. We do believe when a person don't use land for like many years, or maybe this person simply died, or maybe we as the government just don't know where this person is, or maybe like that person just don't use that property, and we can already see in status some buildings that are just not used, that are not cared, and like no one is doing something there. That means that it is like fair to take from that person. Why? Because firstly, that person is not taking responsibility. It is not this person is not doing is not caring about that land. That means that actually we don't have, for example, effective property in the country. That means that like some lands are just sold to someone and it is not used. That means that we just cannot have effective society. Why? Because like it isn't fair to those people that cannot, for example, buy land. Why? Because like other people just bought that and don't use, and it isn't fair to homeless people too. Why? Because they simply don't have home. They don't have home because like some people while they are not having home, some people just bought the property and don't using that. So most likely when a person haven't cared about the property, like for example for 20, 30 years, that means that that person actually do not need that property and even maybe won't come to this property again. Why? Because we already saw that this person haven't cared about that. So that means that it is actually fair to take that land from those people. Why? Because they already like have not been responsible enough, and they already have not used the land effective. They already like have somehow harmed the society by buying land and not using that. So second thing, why it will be like more effective? First thing, that we already have a problem when like much land are just sold and no one is doing nothing with that, and that means that those lands in the world of opposition, they are just not effective. And that means that, and the second problem is that like homeless people, they simply don't have home, they don't have enough help from government. Why? Because government in any world can just help to everyone. Government in any world won't be as effective as we want that government to be. And even if opposition will provide some hundreds of alternatives, would you believe that they won't work? Why? Because like in any case, those homeless people won't simply have home, or in any case, like it will be even better for those people just to go and take that property if they don't have any other alternatives. If government don't help them enough, they can just go and take that property. So basically, what do we get in our world? Most likely, first thing, those homeless people can actually have a home, and they can be like more effective in society. They can just live, and the government is helping somehow those people, and that is already better. Why? Because like we already want to help homeless people. We already want them to adapt to society and some other things like that. So simply in our world, even if that person won't leave that for a long term, won't live in that property for a long term. So first thing, this person just will simply have a home, and that is already better than an opposition when this person simply don't have any help and don't have something from government. And even if government like somehow doing some social help or giving money, this person still just can't afford to buy a house or something like that. And second thing, this person can actually stay for a long term, and that means that those homeless people can actually be more effective. They can just try to develop themselves, and that is like already better, and that is the thing that my teammate already explained. So third point, the motivation and the responsibility of people. Would you believe that in status quo, the problem is that like a person can simply buy a land, and that person won't be afraid of like something happening with that person will believe that even if you won't care about the land, even if you bought that, like for example for business, and then you decided not to do business there, and you just left the land as it was, that means that actually that person is just not responsible enough, and we want to be, or and government want to make more properties effective, because it will be like simply more effective for society as a whole. And that means that in our world, those people will simply have motivation to look after the property, because now they know like if you will leave your property for 50 years, that means that it will go to some other people. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hey.
Thank you very much. Being homeless is bad emotion. They suffer, they really suffer. But in your motion, this big problem, it's based on that fact that we have so many homeless people, and we have not so many homes which activated in this motion. What does it mean? It means that you will never solve the problem of homeless people in general. You just giving a chance to some individual homeless people who have good luck to find this house, this empty house, to have information about this empty house. So your permission to them to do it, it don't solve this problem globally. But we have another problem, which is global problem, what has appearing when you do this motion, do this policy. We think that very important thing, very important thing is the private property. Private property is very important thing. Why? Because this is the guarantee for people not to being scared of something what will become with them in the future. I mean, when government say we respect private property and we will defend it, people always care about their property because they know that they didn't ever have some troubles without making this property not there in one day. We need to respect it. What problem do we have? You say that homeless people have empty house and now they paying taxes, but we think that it doesn't work that way because it will be they are vulnerable group. They go to empty house and they trying to pay in taxes or something like that, but they don't watering a tree in this empty house because they realize that if they cannot pay taxes and they will if they will not pay taxes, they cannot pay taxes because they have a very vulnerable financial statement. They can be go from the this house and another homeless people will go to this house, so they will not feel that this is their private property now because there's another homeless people who can do it for, and you created precedent of making one people about maing term of private property vulnerable, so they will not do it. They will be scared of this. So also, what also important is that individual stories of people who who own empty houses. Maybe this someone who maybe this story of someone who disappeared. He go to the forest and he go from the forest without with realizing of then after several years, and then he realized that now there's homeless people living in his house, and he said, "Oh no!" and he become homeless now. We realize that this is a very vulnerable thing to them. Also, we need to realize that maybe someone want to have a house in tiny village near the sea, and I live in Kazakhstan, and I have a tiny house near sea in Kaskelen, and I go to this house only when I don't have job, when I have vacation, and I can chill. So I can do it only one time for several years, and now you as government say no, as that you can't do it because you need to have only one house and live in this because you just you don't have right to have house which you don't use usually. When opening government says about problem of dead people or don't дееспособные people with disorders, we need to realize that they have reverse of ancestors. We have ancestors, and they have children, they have relatives, they have people who can take this house and sell them. So if someone dead, his wife or her husband or their children can sell it, can do something like that. So we need to realize that this private property have someone who can use it. And also, if someone lived in some house and he's dead, and his children live in another house, maybe they want to make this empty house a museum of people who died. So you can't make people do it because this is a private property. We need to respect it. Okay, maybe we can do something with it if it solves the problem of homeless people globally, but it not fix this problem globally. It's just about just story of some individual people who had so much luck to find empty house, to leave this empty house more earlier than another the homeless people, and wait to to pretend from owning the house, but it don't solve this problem globally. So we have that we don't solve global problem, but we have another global problem, and we think that this is not legitimate reason to take this policy being alive. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the member of government. Here. Shafin, if you are talking now, I cannot hear you. I can't hear you, Shafin. Can you try and talk again? I abruptly hear you now. Try and say a full sentence.
Can you hear me?
Now I could hear you well. All right. Let's hope that it will stay this way.
Okay.
If you get cut off again, I will signal you to stop, and we'll stop the timer.
Okay. As our motion is that we are gonna give those abandoned house to the homeless. Now what does that abandoned house means? Abandoned house means that what you don't use for a long time. As far as the closing opposition said, they were talking about some kind of vacation house. Now, how can a vacation house considered as a abandoned house? Because if you go after 2 years or 1 year, that is not something like abandoned house. The abandoned house is something what in the where the owner of the house is not haven't been seen for a long time, like 15 or 15 years or 20 years, and the house is not working as something what in a fruitful way. Then this is the category of houses that we are gonna give to the homeless people. Now why is it illegitimate to keep this house the way they are right now? Because they don't provide any kind of shelter to anyone. They don't do anything good for the society. But if you give those houses to the homeless people, they will use it to survive their life, and for the survival, one shelter is very important. You can't just deny this fact, and if you deny this fact, you are just make them more vulnerable, that you are not concerned about their vulnerability. Now how will we do that? We will consider those houses which are abandoned for a while, and then we will search for the legit homeless. Now how will you do that? If you just do a survey for one or 2 months, then you can surely assure that these are actual homeless and these are not. Because if a person is being homeless for several months, then it is sure that he or she is actually in need of help and in need of a house. Now, if you as the closing opposition said that if I have a house, it is a job is good. A job is enough for food, but it can't access us to a house or grand house. Now, if you have the capability to earn your own food, then you may not have your own house, but you can rent a house. And we are not talking about those people who are able to rent their house for their own. We are talking about those people who can even do so. That's why they are called homeless. If anyone can rent a house, they won't be called homeless because they have at least home for a while. And if you give those homeless a house to live, then this is how. Then this is then there is a high possibility that the homeless person will be able to manage a new job, and then if he manage to able a new job, you may have buy a new house or may have rent a new house. But if you don't give them those chances, then how will they do so? And as closing opposition said that what if the people came back after several years? Now, as you can as a normal sense, it is not that much possible that a person will survive uh, the natural calamities or something like that in a wild for several years. It is one kind of Robinson Crusoe's drama. Now, if he come back, then you may also have to consider him as a homeless, because he has been homeless for several years now. If you consider him as an homeless, then you all and as we are going to give the those houses to homeless, he will also have a home. And if the person who has the home right now and his condition gets improved, then improve, and he can offer a new house, and we can rent a house, then we will most probably tell him to leave the house and make those another person who are not able to have their house till then. And as you can as closing oppositions was saying that it is only about a few portion or few part of the world. You can do it in the whole world. Now, you can just think that this type of change will be done by overnight. It needs time. You have to move slowly, and you can just you can just fast forward this thing and do it by overnight. And and uh, uh, and the fact what they told about hard work. If you have to do those hard work, you need some resources to do so. And by providing the house, we are giving those the resources to the homeless so that they can do hard work and build their own future. Thank you. That's all from my side.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the member of opposition.
Thank you. That's all from my side.
Can you hear me? Cool. Just a second. All right, 3, 2, 1. Okay, first some framing, then I'll go on to my main points. So first of all, I think the model that OG have set is quite weird. I think first of all, the idea of people who are just unfit physically or mentally are the people whose property you take. First of all, I think people can recover, say, from, like, if you're talking about mental illness. But second of all, I think people who are the physically and mentally unfit are cared for in those homes. So I think it's incredibly marginal. Also, I'm not sure why these people who are probably in need of that house somehow, like this right to their own property is try and find people who need a home. Okay, second of all, I think also the idea of dead people, first of all, that either goes to the next of kin. Second of all, I think even if it doesn't go to the next of kin, it probably goes to the government. I think what the government can do with that house when they've like obtained this house, because it's definite that that person is not returning, right? I think they can probably do more useful things with it. I think this is very much a different case than people who are like own a house and are still alive. So I think this is quite marginal at the point that like quite a few houses are unoccupied, right? I think like presumably the actual people who own these houses are probably those who are quite rich and own several properties but just don't visit them that often. I'm unsure what a long period of time is supposed to be. That could be several months or years, but either way, it's probably people who are rich enough to own these houses, but also are probably rich enough that they can like by whatever checks the government sends to make sure these like think that these places are unoccupied, to like, I'm not sure, even visit them themselves, given that they have enough money to like travel from whatever country they're occupying, or like, I'm not sure, make sure like their neighbors or whatever check on these places and make sure that it looks like that is occupied. So I just think this is incredibly marginal, because people will probably react pretty badly when they think that shit, my house might be actually seized by homeless people, or as in like the house that I paid millions for, my rightful property is just being taken. All right, next on to the idea of like the right to your own property. So OG says just that like the idea of this house is sitting there is ineffective. CG frames this as, because it's not doing anything for society, this is why it should be given up and be put into use of society. This isn't why like we take things from people. I think the fundamental right to your own property is something that is just something that we all care about. I think this is very prominent in society. I mean, there's plenty of things that like is not been like illustrated by either side, why it's only houses in this specific circumstance that should be like the exception from this principle right. So I think there's things like, say for example, there are plenty of people who have money sitting around for years. They would be more useful to people who say people who don't need this money and could do more effective things with it, but this isn't a reason why we allow like that money to be seized. The same thing with food, the same thing with like endless other things. So I think the idea that just because it is not doing anything for society is not the reason why like why these houses should be taken from people. So that principle falls. I think the idea of like something that you've bought, it doesn't matter regardless of whether like say you've inherited the house or you like worked really hard to own it. It is your property, that, and like the idea of buying something means that you own it. That like the idea, it shouldn't matter how long you have not been using it. We are not like judged by the definitive time of which we've been using it by in order to determine whether we still own it or not. It's like incredibly weird. All right. So like but also, even if Gov does try to claim like, oh, well, this is the only possible way, it isn't. I mean, I think, for instance, the idea that, well, in order to make sure that these properties are, one, not occupied, but also second of all, that somehow to verify these people are actually homeless. I mean, that takes a lot of resources, right, to be able to like have people go checking out on these things, etc. I think also like all this like administration, etc. There are plenty of other alternatives, such as job schemes, homeless shelters, or even like properties that the government already owns that can be given out to people homeless who are homeless temporarily. I think what this means is that people can actually get back on their feet, but also that like you don't get this kind of say backlash from people, but also how you don't harm this principle of people who own these houses. So I think additionally, you probably like, there's probably also this negative public perception. Right now, like we can say that homeless people are actually quite vulnerable. First of all, because people actually do treat them terribly, but also the perception against them is bad. I think when you, like the government also puts in this policy, that means that like they can actually like take your property from them. This increases very negative perceptions of them. It's quite dangerous, and the idea that just already these people are very stigmatized, they are treated awfully, but also the idea that this can be increase even worse. This means like there will be certain like negative backlash that doesn't go beyond just like people being angry about it, but also actively harming these people in ways certain just like the idea of viewing these people as like, even if they don't like go political on this, but viewing these people as enemies. I think first of all, just like people who can like take your property. I think this probably goes in very negative ways in certain instances of whether people feel empathy for these people or not. I think it can make a great difference to a person's day that you do actually say buy them a meal or you give them €5 or something like this, because that means they can actually eat for a day, etc., or like are able to get a bus somewhere or like visit, or like just to have some sort of quality of life. I mean, and because like, first of all, because it's so unlikely that as soon as you implement this, that many homeless people will actually be able to get a house. First of all, because either like because these houses are just ones that people don't want to lose. So like you have a very marginal instance of people who actually are able to get homes. So at the end of the day, what we think is probably the bigger impact here is how people perceive this as well. But also how not only are you going against this principle, right? Like to your property, but people acting incredibly angry against us. If people view homeless people as an enemy, people will react in several ways. First of all, they'll just like more likely to vote out the government, because like being able to lose your like say $2 million holiday home is probably something pretty impactful, something you'll probably be pretty angry about, and enough to like say like vote for on policies, etc. But also just your perception of whether these people are people who deserve empathy. You're not going to feel like empathy for them when you see those people who can steal from you, rather than people perceiving like these are people below me and oh, I'll be sympathetic and give them some money. I mean, regardless of how you view them, I think it's important whether you do give them money or not, right? So I think like if you no longer see them as people who are just below you and never will be above you, like just for the fact that you have like immense amounts of money and power, the difference here is whether this is actually like, but if you suddenly see them as a threat to you, or some like are gaining substantially more rights. First of all, this is just one right, but also there's a stance of people just having this kind of like a slippery slope perception of now they're going to get so many more rights than me, and like this will get people very angry. But also just like how they treat homeless people, whether they give money to homeless shelters, whether they support policies that actually help homeless people. These are things that will be effective. Thank you. Affected. Sorry.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the government whip. Hey, hey. I'd like to thank the previous speaker for a very fine speech, and I am very happy to call upon the opposition whip. Hey, hey.
Okay.
Layla, you're muted.
Okay. Just
I think you're muted again.
the first thing that CG is talking about is how closing opposition is not saying how the media perception of homeless people is going to change for the good when they are in the houses rather than on the streets. The thing is, well, okay, first of all, closing government is saying that this debate is not supposed to be about politics and how the politics affect the state of life of homeless people and how it affects the state of life of wealth. Well, the thing is, the social status of homeless people, which is the main focus of this debate, is going to be shifted. The perception is going to be shifted, and consequently, the political social status of homeless people is going to be shifted because of the motion which the government is trying to tell us to accept. Why is this true? Because the homeless people in status quo being vulnerable enough to be suppressed by society and to be perceived as ones of lower class is something that is happening and is something that is harming them a lot in the contemporary world. But when we accept the motion, what happens is that the perception of them is going to shift to the place where they are even more perceived as a threat, not only by people who see them on streets or the people who see them in media, but by people who have, well, who own houses and who have properties and who know that even if the situation happens when they are, for one reason or another, not able to live or stay in their house for long enough, for however long enough the government is saying us, their house is going to be threatened to be intruded by the homeless people. And even though opening is trying to tell us that, well, the state of house is going to be better because there is someone living there, and everything like that, what we should understand is that, well, what is the probability that the state of the house is going to be better because of homeless person living there, if we know that the homeless person is already in a position of life where he or she or they cannot afford to live? Because the thing is, when a homeless person knows that they are not going to live in this house forever, what they are going to do is, well, definitely not look after the house as well as opening government is trying to convince us they are. What opening government is also saying is that the person who bought a house and does it and didn't visit it for long enough for the homeless person to get in, this person is harming the country, this person is harming the government by having land and wasting it. But the thing is, this debate is not about this debate is probably not about the countries where the land is a factor that is going to impact the wellness of government the most, because there are only so many countries where the territory is something that should be put higher in importance than the welfare of the citizens. What government also says is that now homeless will have a home, and that is better than not having a home. Well, the thing is, neither of governments explain to us why alternatives which exist in status quo are not going to work. And those alternatives are things like social housing. These alternatives are things like just the governmental programs of helping homeless people by spending the government money instead of forcing people of wealth to spend their money and resources on those people. POI from OG, sure.
Okay, so why do you think that, like, if those homeless people can take care enough, why that is something really, really important? Because, like, they still can have a home. So we just don't understand the importance of everything like that.
Yeah, that's not, that wasn't my main point. What CG is telling us is that the immediate perception of those people, who are on the streets and who are in the houses are going to be different, and if we accept the motion, is going to be better and help them. But the thing is, the backlash is going to be much bigger. The backlash from wealthy people, the backlash from the society is going to be much bigger than that is in status quo, for all the reasons we already said. What opening opposition is telling us are the reasons for why this motion is not going to work, which are true but abrupt. And the point is that closing opposition has done a greater job of showing actual practical impacts and harms that are going to affect the homeless people and their social status in the world. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the previous speaker and all speakers in the debate for a very fun debate. I'm going to take a couple of minutes or so to go over my notes. Feel free to talk on whatever in the meanwhile. The call, as I now see it, is the following. First goes to closing opposition, second goes to opening opposition, third to opening government, and fourth, unfortunately, to closing government. The closest part is probably the top half comparison. the part of the code they feel most confident about is COs first, but I can see literally any sort of combination going around here. I'll try to flag throughout my justification why this is the case. But before that, now that I have you as a captive audience, few pieces of general feedback that I do think are quite important. So first thing, while it's not content-wise relevant to debate winning, I think it is worthwhile mentioning. At some times, I think some of the wordings used to describe certain populations were a bit non-sensitive as they could have been. Things such as, to give a couple of examples, referring to people with mental disabilities as people with a not good mind, or referring to people who are unemployed as lazy. Now, to be clear, I don't think anyone here had any ill intent. I'm ESL myself, I know the struggle, and I'm certain that it was an issue of English rather than an issue of anything else. I would just advise that when we talk about vulnerable populations, we try to actively think more how we describe them, because some people might take it as offensive, and it's a shame to risk it potentially. Second thing, and this is already a bit more relevant to the debate, weighings. I think the most important thing I have to say is and why this call ended up being so hard to read, in my opinion, is the lack of direct comparison to one another. So I think the main thing here, teams kind of escaped biting the bullet on different fronts and actually explaining which we should care about more. Like, realistically speaking, in this debate, some poor people, some homeless people are going to get a house. Some people who currently have a house that they don't use are going to lose it. And not only dead people, but presumably there's a bullet to bite, and there are actually people whose property is going to be harmed. Which should we care about more? This was the main thing that I was lacking. I got a lot of explanation on harm to one group, harm to another, and not as much actually trying to break this deadlock by explaining which we should care about more. So I think this is the main thing teams could have benefited more from. And then the last thing, I think this debate was very much lacking in a model. Now, I think potentially, like to an extent, you could say that it is on the PM. However, I think that it's not only the PM not giving a model. I think it's also no speaker from opposition giving a clarification once a model was not given, and then B, no team giving an analysis on the likely characterization. Because one question that impacted a lot of clashes in the debate is the question of who are the owners of those empty houses? Are they like dead people or people who haven't been there for literally decades? Or are those people who are just on like using this house as a vacation house and are likely to come back at some point? And I think addressing this question would have helped a lot of your cases, not just giving the possibility that it can be this and it can be that, but actually giving analysis as to what is the likely scenario. We could have escaped the need to do it as analysis if it was being given in a model, because I think it's fair of opening government to give a model such as, we are only going to do that for houses which are not occupied for 20 years or so. But if a model isn't given, either side wants to analyze the likely scenario. Just one last thing to be said about the model, because I think it's also worthwhile to discuss the fact that strategically, there is a question of what is preferable for governments to define in this debate. Because it is very tempting to try to mitigate the debate to non-existence, but by making it only about houses that are nearly never were ever occupied and only dead people and like decades that have no one have lived in them, etc. And I get why it's tempting to do so, because it kind of mitigates the bullet that government needs to bite, because it means that we don't take property from many people. But it's worthwhile noting that it does two things that might also harm government strategically, and you want to consider whether or not you want to do that. Firstly, it mitigates your own impact. It means that less poor people are going to get a house. But secondly, it also gives a concession of your principle, because it kind of implicitly means that you concede that if it were someone who didn't inhabit a house for only a year or two, of course, we should never take away their property right, at which point you implicitly concede that property rights in many occasions is overriding the right to housing. So just a thought to take into consideration. Yeah, so with that in mind, let's get to the call and a lot of the mess inside. So to reiterate the call for whoever forgot, CO, OO, OG, CG. Let's start with the top half, three main clashes. Firstly, who are the owners of those empty houses? Secondly, justification. And thirdly, what helps the poor more? First question, who is the owner or the owners of these houses? From OG, we get the following characterization. There are many countries in which, for weird reasons of regulations, there are situations in which people who literally don't exist anymore, some people that the country doesn't know where they are, people who might even be dead, are just still have their houses registered under their names. In addition to that, there are some people who can't manage their own house because of certain disabilities, physical or mental, for which reason they leave their house empty. From OO, we get the characterization that some people have it as a village house that they go to on vacations. Some people may be students who study abroad and want to go back to this house once they come back. Some people have a house that they don't currently use, but they want to leave as inheritance to their kids. And some people, I believe the example was said, live for a short while in the forest, but want to come back at some point to their house. I'm not sure exactly who this population is. I think the point being, by the end of this clash, the main conclusion that I'm going to get is probably we have both. So I get some extreme characterizations on both sides, that there are some people who might never, ever, ever go back to their house, which were not directly refuted at any point, aside from saying from opening opposition that if it is the case of someone who is dead, their family can inherit it, which is fine, but I guess still doesn't engage the people who are cognitively or physically disabled, or the point about the people who we just don't know where they are, etc., or maybe people who don't have kids. And from opposition, we get counter characterizations of like people who went away for a period of time, etc. No one analyzes analytically what is like the more likely scenario. It sounds like this is an example and this is an example, so I'm going to end up believing that both are probably correct, and some of the cases are like that and some of the cases are like this. With that in mind, let's go to the second question of justification. What do we get from both sides? From OG, we get one main point of constructive and a few points of mitigation. The main point of constructive is mostly what comes in DPM. It's just unfair. It's unfair that some people don't have a house and some people have a house that they don't even use. Unfortunately, this is pretty much where the analysis of this constructive point ended, with the idea that it's unfair. Now, while intuitively I might agree, and it does sound a bit off that this is the case in the world we live in, there was no actual analysis to explain why it's morally wrong, aside from this sounding intuitively unfair. In contrast, and I'm going to address the mitigation soon, in contrast, OO does give analysis as to why the right to property is something we should care about, which is going slightly beyond just the intuition. They do explain that this is something that you worked for, invested a lot of money in, and a lot of time in, and something that you care deeply about. They also provide some analogies of when we don't take away people's property to give it to the poor. At which point, they go a step farther from the intuition to say there is a structural reason for why we should care about property rights, which is the fact that when someone works for something, they have a claim of it that people who didn't work for it don't have. To which opening government gives the following mitigations. Firstly, they wouldn't even notice because they are no longer living there. This is, however, contingent on the first question of the characterization. This mitigation would have been true if OG would have proven without reasonable doubt that the vast majority of the cases are people that are never going to come back to their house. At the point which I am accepting by the end of the first question, that there are at least many people, even if not all of the cases or even not the likely cases, but at least many of the people in this debate are going to come back at some point, I am going to have to accept that there is still a harm to property rights happening here. Second mitigation, the idea that the people inside the houses do have an incentive to still maintain it because they want the house to be kept, which is an interesting idea, but one that was not sufficiently eventually connected to why it helps in any way the people who lose their houses. So I get why their houses are not being destroyed, but presumably, as much as I followed OG, but it could be also the lack of a clear model that made the point insufficiently clear. It doesn't sound as though the house ever gets back to the people who owned it. So even if it is maintained, it is unclear how it then helps solve the problem of people losing their house, even if it stays in a good condition. Yeah, and I think this is pretty much the end of the mitigations from OG. at the end of which I need to weigh between the idea of some people who do have a use for it and who worked very hard for it, in compared to the fact that it is unfair. I would opt to go with opposition's rationale here because A, it is less based on intuition and a bit more mechanized, but B, because I think the connection to ownership was better made. That is, the mere fact of something being unfair and of some people not having something that they want or need does not yet explain why they have a right to it, why they deserve to have it. OO explains why the people who earned it do have a claim and a right to it. They don't just want it, but they have earned it. One last thing that I wanted to address in this clash that I did not end up actually crediting from OO, but just to address it. OO also attempted another sort of mitigation / weighing when they said it doesn't solve homelessness, so it only helps very few people. And while they are correct, and I accept it only helps very few people, this is not the burden on government in this debate. Like, even helping a few people is obviously a good thing. They don't have the burden to solve homelessness. And the reason why it won't serve also as a weighing is, insofar as it helps only a very few people, it also harms very few people. Like the same amount of people who lose a house, or the same amount of people who earn a house, because it's the same house. I can't explain it mathematically more than that. So this particular part will not end up being very crucial for the comparison. However, OO will still win the question of justification, just for having a better mechanistic connection of their principle to ownership. And then the last question on the top half, and why this particular comparison in the call ended up being the closest one, I think, and the one that I continue flipping in my head. What helps the poor better? And this one, I think OG actually won above OO. So to explain what I get from both sides, OG gives 3 mechanisms as to why this motion is likely to help the poor. First, it will just give them a place to live, which is generally a nice thing to have. Secondly, it will help their employability because many employers don't want to employ people who are homeless because they have stigma against them. And thirdly, it lets them save money that they would otherwise need to spend on rent, and they can use this money for food and insurance, etc. From OO, I get the following 2 points. And by the way, no direct rebuttal aside from saying that this does not solve homelessness, which, as I addressed before, is not enough. So I am going to evidently accept these points from OG as standing by the end of the top half. From OO, we get the following points. Firstly, people are going to get less of an incentive to work once they know that they can just so easily get a house like that. I think the issue with this is, while it was not directly refuted, unfortunately, I think the analysis to back this claim to be true in the first place was a bit lacking. It is not sufficiently clear why the potential of me getting a house and not anything else is going to be enough for me having no incentive to work, especially when OO themselves concede that most poor people are not going to get a house via this motion, that there are more homeless than there are people who have houses uninhabited, at which point I am not so sure why so many people are going to have an incentive not to work at all. So I think these points stood weaker in comparison to OG's points. The second thing that OO adds on this particular question is that when you have many people in one house, we won't be able to manage it. How are you going to have so many people in one house? I think here the main issue is, like, that there are a couple of issues. One of them is more significant than the other. So the more significant issue is that OO doesn't actually analyze why many people in a house is harm, but rather they present a rhetorical question. How are you going to manage so many people in one house? Don't know. I can think of some ways. I don't want to fill in the analysis for opening government, of course, by trying to think of those ways, but I similarly don't want to fill in the analysis for opening opposition by explaining why you can't. I have no idea why you can't have many people in one house. The rhetorical question is left as a question that remains unanswered, and I never get the actual analysis as to why it is harmful to have many people in one house. I think the closest thing that I get to that is later on, when DLO adds that when you have many people in one house, you have less of an incentive to maintain it because it's not really yours, which is, I guess, intuitive to an extent, a bit of competing analysis to opening governments already existing, but you still have an incentive because you're going to live there, and I'm not sure which is more correct. But I think the main reason why it will end up falling to opening government is that it is being not comparative to the alternative opening government presents of living on the street. And I think even if I'm going to accept that this lack of maintenance is not great, it's hard to accept without further analysis that it is worse than having literally no house at all. The last problem with this argument, which is smaller than the earlier one, is that it's kind of reliant on a model that I'm not certain is the model for the debate, which says that we're going to put all the homeless people in the houses. I think the likely way to read the debate is that we are only going to allow it insofar as when the house is empty, you can get in. Once a homeless person is already in the house, and no longer homeless, by the way, no one else can get in. However, this was not defined in the model because there was no clear model, so I'm not sure to what extent I can credit this. But the main issue is, regardless of this, even if I accept this point to an extent, I think on the comparison of living on the street, it still loses to the benefits described by opening government. At which point, I'm at a problem, because this is exactly why I would want a weighing to take into place. Because I get from opening opposition a winning of the question on justification, and opening government winning on the question of what helps the poor more, and no one explains which is more important. And according to the debate adjudication briefing, no question, practical or principle, is logically prior inherently to any other question. Nothing is inherently more important. I can't make this decision as an objective judge. My reason to very marginally lean towards OO, but caveated, I have reservations about it and I might be biased. I think the way that the argument of property rights from OO was presented was, in a way, presented to be more logically prior to the argument of practical benefits from opening government. That is, in the analogies at least, OO do explain we don't take away people's property to save the poor. If it's theirs, then we don't take it away even if it helps many people. In particular, I think this is also to an extent conceded by opening government when they continuously give the mitigations of no one will ever come back to this house and this is why it's justified, implicitly conceding that if someone does come back to this house, if it is someone's property, then probably they do care about the property more than they care about general poverty. Now, it's a bit of a stretch here. I usually avoid doing these things because I don't think any of what I just said was said very explicitly in the debate by opening opposition. I think, however, it's the closest metric I have to work with as a weighing, which will lead me to very marginally accept the principal question of property rights to be logically prior here to helping the poor, because even if it helps the poor, it is not clear that this is the justified method to help them, that it is right to, in a way, steal from someone else in order to help them. But I can see it going both ways in a very legitimate way. Are there questions on the top half before I move on to the bottom half? All right. I see there is a question of after the rationale, but are there questions on the comparison on the top half before that? Cool. Let's then move to the bottom half. What did we get from CG? I will say, I think most of CG's additions were in the negative or in the rebuttals that they've added, which I'll address soon. But firstly, in terms of the constructive, what did they bring to the table? I think the main constructive point from CG is the idea that you need resources in order to be employable. That in order to get to a job, you need to have resources such as a house. Now, granted, I think there is some extent of potential new material here. I think the term used in the member of government was resources and got extended a bit in a government whip to explain what resources mean in terms of giving you a feeling of safety. However, I think it is a fair enough addition in terms of A, CO did have a chance to engage with that at least, and B, I think this is just giving slight more nuance to an already made claim, so I'm willing to accept this. So I do accept that on the constructive, CG does have the extension of having a house also gives you more feeling of safety that enables you to address job interviews more. The next additions are, I think, are mostly negative in their nature, or mostly rebuttal points that I get from CG in both speeches. So the first one is that the alternatives are not likely to work. Alternatives such as public housing, etc., are just time consuming, like you need, it's not time consuming, but like it takes time until they reach out to you and they are unapproachable, so it's less likely to be effective. Secondly, the idea that it is similar to taxes, which is why it is kind of justified, because we already do things such as take people's property. And then I think there were a couple of more things and justification that came exclusively in WIP that I have a bit of an issue with, that I'm going to explain shortly. The first one is underweighing. It's just less important. Someone having a house is more valuable to them than someone not having multiple houses. I think this is just slightly different terminology than what was already said in opening government about fairness, about some people not having a house at all when some people have more houses than they need is unfair. I think it's kind of the same claim in different wordings and still doesn't solve for the problem that OO places of, even if it is unfair or even if it is more worth more to them than it is to the rich, it's unclear that it makes it justified to take it from the rich. And then the second thing that was coming in WIP was the idea of a veil of ignorance. Now, a couple of issues with the veil of ignorance point. Firstly, this part I do think is too much of new material for me to be able to credit. I don't think the veil of ignorance was mentioned in any point in Member, and I do think that this is not just a rebuttal. It is a constructive point to explain why we have a moral obligation to prefer this world. But I think a second issue with this point is it wasn't very much analyzed to explain why this is the right metric. That is, there was given the explanation as to why behind the veil of ignorance we would prefer this world, but there was no explanation as to why behind the veil of ignorance is the right metric to judge this, or why this is the way we should decide which is morally preferable. So I think these latter 2 points ended up being less credited in the comparison. On the rest of the material, firstly, let's start with the constructive and why I believe it ended up losing to OG. And then let's talk about the negative material and why it didn't end up being sufficient compared to oppositions. On the constructive, the safety to go to interviews and the feeling of having a house behind you. While it is definitely new, I think from OG, I already get the following. A, they already have their own point about employability for a different reason, which is the stigma that comes with being homeless. Now, while this is a different reason, I don't think CG ever gave an explanation as to why this is a better reason. They reached the same bottom line for different reasons, and they never analyzed which is more important. But the second thing is, OG has more than just employability. They also add on top of employability the fact that you just have a house in general, the fact that you have no more free money to be able to use for food and insurance, etc. At this point, with OG having slightly more practical benefits, and CG not making the direct weighing that it is their burden to make, I am going to lean towards OG on the constructive. As for the negative material, here's why it didn't end up being sufficient in comparison to OO. I'll get to CO later because I realized that there were also direct rebuttals to CO. In relation to OO, the point about taxes. I think I have had 2 issues with the point about taxes about why it didn't end up being sufficient. One of them, and the more important of them, it was preempted. The leader of opposition already said in advance, people already pay taxes. The difference is that now it's unequal. It's only some people who have the extra house that pay it. This was never directly responded to by the closing government. But the second issue is, I am not sure why it is analogous to taxation. This is important because there was a battle of analogies here. Because OO also give analogies. The fact that we don't steal people's money in order to pay the poor all the time, right? So obviously there are examples on both sides. There are some things that there are occasions in which we are fine with prioritizing the general good over property, such as taxation, and there are occasions in which we are not, when we don't justify theft for the poor. And CG doesn't explain why this particular case is more similar to taxes than it is to theft. I think it is more of CG's burden to explain why their analogy applies in comparison to OO for 2 reasons. Firstly, they came later in the debate. Secondly, neither CG speaker took any POI, at which point I'm going to go with OO's logic here of saying they put it first. CG had the chance to engage and weigh their analogy to be better. OO didn't, so I'm going to go with OO here. And then the point about alternatives, okay, the point about alternatives is going to be more significant in comparison to CO. I'll get to CO soon, but In relation to OO, I just think that OO are not contingent on that. They mentioned the idea of alternatives, but I think OO mostly win on the justification point of just saying it's harming like people's property. So even if you have no alternative, even if the alternative is getting on the street, at the point at which it just does not justify theft to fix it, I'm still going to lean towards OO for the same reason that I lean towards them on the top half comparison. At which point, there is still some question as to should I place CG above OG just for their negative material, because I think at some points the rebuttals and engagement were slightly better than OG's. And this is also a discussion to be had, and this is also why this was also a close call. My current leaning would be to say, given that on the constructive they lose, they don't do a direct weighing, including of weighing the rebuttals above OG. And the rebuttals didn't end up being sufficient to win oppositions. I'm going to lean towards saying that OG's slightly better constructive contributed better to the chances of winning the debate than CG's unsuccessful rebuttals. For those reasons, I'm leaning towards putting CG below both top half teams. Are there questions on this part of the comparison before I get to CO? Okay, CO it is. What do I get from CO? All right, I think the main, there was one main extension, one good framing, and then two smaller stuff that didn't end up being too important, admittedly. But the two important stuff were the following. Firstly, it harms the perception of the poor. I'll get to CG's rebuttal on that soon. It harms the perception of the poor for several reasons. A, people are now afraid for their property. B, there is a slippery slope perception of people feeling that now they might be next. They might extend it to also already inhabited houses. And C, just the fact that it's like reinforces stereotypes about poor people being kind of up for your property, etc. The second important, and for those reasons, we have worse perception leads to less donations, less good policies, etc. The second important addition is in the framing, which is important because, note my main point about weighings throughout the debate. This framing was the closest thing to a direct weighing done throughout the debate. The framing is the following. A, there are very few houses that are going to be used thanks to this motion. And secondly, there are some alternatives. For those reasons, again, I'm going to address CG soon. For those reasons, the marginal impact on both populations that top have discussed, whether it is the poor who get a house or the rich who lose a house, is small. The impact of perception is one that impacts all poor people wherever they are. So this impact is much larger, which is the closest thing to a weighing, which will end up leading to me believing that CO's point in itself just wins the top half because they discuss a harm that impacts a much larger population than either top half teams. Just to address some of the smaller stuff from closing opposition. One of them is the addition on the mutual exclusivity point. And that is, unlike they don't just say there is an alternative or there are alternatives, but they explain why these alternatives are mutually exclusive with the motion to an extent, because there are some resources invested in the motion in order to check who inhabits the houses, in order to check who is actually homeless and who isn't, and these resources could be invested in public housing. Granted, I think part of why this point is quite small, I'm not sure how much public housing you can buy with that. Like, I think one of the issues here is I get why there are resources invested in the motion, but it doesn't sound like a lot of resources to have like one person to need to check for all of these things. So it doesn't sound like you're going to get a lot of public housing on your side. But it was also not said in the debate, despite CG having a chance to say this, so less important at this point. But it did end up being quite small. And the second addition from CO was a new analogy, which will mostly be credited as a rebuttal. I don't think I will be able to credit it as the constructive extension. But in relation to OG, they do kind of add the explanation as to why specifically OG's metric of fairness is not the one we should use. And they use the following analogy. And that is, many people already accumulate wealth, and we don't think that we need to take it away from them just because it's unfair. The mere fact of savings being something that happens is exactly an example of people accumulating wealth that they don't use because they save it, yet we don't take away people's savings in order to give it to the poor. I don't think this makes a justification point in terms of analyzing a moral obligation to not do the motion or to show that the motion is morally abhorrent, because I don't think it was analyzed enough in order to actually make this point stand. I do think it was about as well analyzed as the initial point of saying it's unfair, for which reason I'm going to accept that it serves as a sufficient rebuttal to OG's justification. But more importantly, regardless of this rebuttal, the main reason why CO will take it above the top half is because they did give a simple, analyzed, standing case on the implications on the perception of the poor in general, and they simply weighed it, which I think is the main thing I want to also take from this debate. They explained why it's more important than other stakeholders. It just impacts much more people. And then, lastly, let's bring back CG, because CG did have some rebuttals to CO that needs to be discussed. The first rebuttal that CG brings to CO is the idea that the social perception point is not comparative, because the social perception is much worse when you see the poor people on the street and reinforcing stereotypes on the street, rather than when you think that they come for your house. Two reasons why this rebuttal will not be sufficient. Firstly, I will say it's unclear why. I can intuitively see where it's going. I can see potential harms of seeing poor people on the street, but it was never explained why these harms are worse than thinking that they might be after your house. But secondly, and more importantly, as all teams in this debate concede, this motion is not going to solve homelessness, meaning that people still see poor people on the street, but also, in addition to that, fear that they might go for their houses. So the point about this being not comparative is not actually one that is sticking without showing that the comparative is uniquely on their side seeing poor people on the street. It sounds as though on both sides you're going to see poor people on the street. The second point of rebuttal from CG is the idea about the alternatives and why they are not sufficiently effective. Now, the main reason why it will end up losing to CO is mostly because it's rebutting the smaller point of CO rather than their main point of perception. And I think regardless of this, the perception point will remain standing and weighed. But I also think that while this rebuttal stands, I want to flag that it is mostly mitigatory. So to be clear, to the extent of the analysis that I get from CG is enough for me to believe that getting public housing or housing through other welfare systems is harder and have some disadvantages because they are somewhat less approachable, because it takes somewhat more time. I don't think CG managed to prove their point to the extent of it's something you're never going to get. The fact that you have some barriers of bureaucracy and it takes more time to get a house doesn't mean you remain homeless, all homeless people remain homeless forever. So I get some less people are going to be aided, I get some people are going to be aided later, but presumably some people are still going to get help, and this is still mutually exclusive because now we lose these resources for the motion. For those reasons, the rebuttal will also not suffice in comparison to CO. For all those reasons, CO wins the debate. Are there questions on the call as a whole? All right. Personal feedback. I'm happy to stay here now with anyone who wants personal feedback now. Otherwise, feel free to approach me later. That's also fine. If I don't answer you immediately, it's because I'm waking up tomorrow at 5:30 to judge in India. So do feel very free to ping me and remind me. I judge so much lately that I sometimes just miss messages. It's not intentional. But in any other case, let's start with those who are here and